Every morning, like a ghost set to a timer, the donkey appeared. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the same gray donkey would materialize at the edge of Sterling Maddox's property. It wouldn't graze. It wouldn't wander. It would just stand there, as still as a statue, its dark eyes locked on the old Henderson house next door. That house had been a hollowed-out shell for over a decade, a monument to forgotten things. Sterling had first spotted the animal during his first week on the ranch. He chalked it up to coincidence, a simple quirk of animal routine. But this was no routine. This was a vigil. Every single day, without fail, the donkey positioned itself at the exact same spot, facing the house's grimy front window, with an unnerving intensity that made the hairs on Sterling's arms stand up. He'd timed it once, out of a morbid curiosity that was quickly turning to unease. For 47 minutes precisely, the animal remained motionless, a sentinel waiting for a signal that never came. But today was different. Today, the ritual was broken. The donkey hadn't stopped at its usual post. It had moved closer, much closer, right up to the rotting porch of the Henderson house itself. And as Sterling watched from his kitchen window, he could swear he heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a wooden table, coming from inside that supposedly empty, silent building. Sterling's hand went for the rifle he kept by the door. Not because he truly expected danger, but because 30 years of ranch life had burned one lesson into his soul. When animals break their patterns, there's always a reason, and it's never a good one. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. As he began the short walk toward the Henderson house for the first time since buying the neighboring land, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He had no idea that what he was about to find inside that derelict home wouldn't just solve the mystery of the donkey. It would shatter everything he thought he knew about his own family. For 3 long months, Sterling had been the sole audience for this bizarre daily spectacle. The gray donkey, appearing like clockwork, planting its hooves by the same weathered fence post that marked the border between his land and the Henderson property. He'd tried to reason it out, to find a logical explanation. He'd walked the perimeter of the abandoned house not once but twice, scanning the ground for anything that might lure an animal. Salt licks, mineral deposits, even the ghost of old feed buckets. He found nothing. The house stood silent and dead. Its windows were boarded up tight, all except for that one gaping front window that the donkey stared at with such haunting devotion. The story from old Pete at the general store was that the Henderson family had vanished one winter, packed up and left in the middle of the night. Something about bad debts and worse family trouble? That was 12 years ago. The house had been collecting dust and shadows ever since. Sterling had bought his ranch from a bank auction 3 months back, inheriting this strange, silent neighbor and its four-legged stalker along with the property lines. But today felt charged. Different. The donkey had broken its own sacred rule. It had crossed the invisible line, standing right at the foot of the Hendersons' front steps. Sterling could see it plain as day from his kitchen, and what sent a shiver down his spine was the animal's posture. It wasn't grazing, it wasn't exploring, it was waiting. Sterling pulled on his worn leather boots, the familiar weight a small comfort. He grabbed his hat and stepped onto his porch, the old wood groaning under his boots. The donkey's ears twitched at the sound, a subtle acknowledgement, but it didn't turn. Its focus remained locked on the house. "Easy there," Sterling called out, his voice soft, trying not to spook it. He approached slowly, deliberately. The donkey stayed put, its deep brown eyes fixed on that single uncovered window. As Sterling got closer, his own eyes caught something he'd missed from a distance. The ground around the front steps was wrong. It was worn smooth, packed down, as if something heavy had been dragged back and forth across it, over and over again. He saw fresh scratches marring the gray, weathered wood of the steps themselves. He knelt, his heart starting to pound a little faster. He ran a finger over the gouges in the wood. They were recent, frighteningly recent. The cuts were clean and sharp, the exposed wood a pale white against the darker, aged surface. This wasn't the work of years of decay. Someone or something had been here, and they'd been here within the last few days. Sterling's hand instinctively tightened around the stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder. The donkey finally broke its trance, turning its head to look directly at him. And in that moment, Sterling swore he saw something almost human in its eyes. Not anything supernatural, just a raw, undeniable intelligence, a purpose. It was like the animal was trying to tell him something, to warn him. And that's when he heard it again. That same rhythmic tapping from inside the house. Louder this time. Closer. It wasn't the random creak of a settling foundation or the rattle of a loose board in the wind. This was deliberate. This was the unmistakable sound of someone knocking, from the inside out. His hands started to tremble, a fine tremor he couldn't control. Sterling forced his feet to move, one step at a time, toward the front door of the Henderson house. The knocking had stopped the second he moved, plunging the world back into a thick, heavy silence that felt far more threatening than the sound it replaced. At least with the noise, he knew where it was coming from. Now it could be anywhere. He noticed the front door was hanging slightly ajar. That was wrong. He was certain, absolutely positive, that it had been shut tight on all his previous glances from his own property. The brass doorknob was green with tarnish, but not rusted through. He gave it a tentative push. The door swung inward on its hinges, smooth and silent. Far too smooth for a house that had been left to rot for 12 years. The smell hit him first, and it wasn't what he expected. Not the musty, dead air of decay and trapped memories. This was different. It was fresher, with a faint, lingering scent underneath, almost like someone had been cooking. Recently, Sterling's pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped over the threshold, his boots making a hollow sound on the hardwood floors that echoed in the unnatural stillness. The front room was sparse, but it was clean. Far too clean. A thin, even layer of dust coated some of the surfaces, yes, but it wasn't the thick, caked-on grime that a decade of neglect should have produced. Someone had been here. Someone had been maintaining this place, or at the very least, visiting it on a regular basis. His eyes were drawn to the floor near the window, the very window the donkey was obsessed with. Footprints. He could see them clearly in the thin layer of dust. They were small, the distinct outline of a woman's boot. And they were fresh. His throat went bone dry. Someone had been standing right here, in this exact spot, looking out at his property, looking out at him. Sterling moved deeper into the house, his rifle held ready now. He found the source of the knocking in what he assumed had been the kitchen. A loose shutter on the back window was swinging gently, tapping against the window frame. An open and shut case. A simple explanation that should have brought a wave of relief. But it didn't, because something was fundamentally wrong. The shutter was moving in a steady, perfect rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. But there wasn't a breath of wind today. The air outside was perfectly still. Sterling stepped closer, his suspicion growing into a cold certainty. He examined the shutter. A thin, almost invisible piece of string was tied to the bottom slat. The other end of the string disappeared through a tiny crack in the window frame. Someone had rigged this. They had deliberately created a simple, elegant mechanism designed to make a rhythmic noise at regular intervals. It was a signal. But for who? And for what? Then he saw it. On the dusty kitchen table, a stack of unopened letters, his first real clue. They were all addressed to a Mrs. C. Henderson. The postmarks were all recent, all within the last 6 months. But it was the return address that made Sterling's blood run cold. Maddox Family Trust, Denver, Colorado, his own family name, staring back at him from a ghost mail. Sterling's hands shook as he reached for the top envelope. It was from a law firm he didn't recognize, but the embossed text was clear, regarding estate settlement and property rights. The envelope was sealed, but he could feel something thick inside. Documents, maybe even photographs. Behind him, he heard a soft click-clack on the front porch. Hoofbeats. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The donkey. It had followed him. He could see its gray silhouette through the kitchen doorway, standing on the front porch, watching him. Still watching, still waiting. He was about to tear open the first letter, driven by a desperate need for answers, when a new sound cut through the silence. Footsteps on the front porch. Heavy boots. Definitely human. And they were moving with a steady, confident purpose toward the door he'd foolishly left wide open. Someone was coming, and he was trapped. Trapped inside a house he had no business being in, with letters in his hand that belonged to a ghost. Sterling shoved the letters into his jacket pocket, his mind a frantic mess of adrenaline and fear. He scrambled toward the back of the house, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps on the front porch were closer now, louder. He could hear the distinct sound of whoever it was testing the doorknob, their hand turning the same tarnished brass he'd touched just minutes ago. He risked a glance through the grimy kitchen window. He saw the gray donkey trot calmly around the side of the house, moving toward the front as if it were going to greet a friend. This wasn't random. The animal knew this person. The donkey was part of this. Sterling ducked behind the kitchen counter, the cold linoleum pressing against his cheek. He clutched his rifle, his knuckles white. The front door creaked open again. And then he heard a woman's voice. It was soft, but carried a firmness that cut through the tension in the air. "Easy, Moses. I know you brought someone here." Moses. The donkey had a name. The single word sent a jolt through Sterling. It recontextualized everything. This wasn't an abandoned house, and that wasn't a stray animal. Someone was living here, or at least coming here. Someone was caring for the donkey, maintaining the property in secret. But who? The woman's footsteps moved through the front room. She walked with the easy confidence of someone who knew the location of every creaking floorboard, every piece of furniture. Sterling could hear her talking again, her voice a low murmur, speaking to the donkey with a tone of quiet affection and deep familiarity. "You did good, boy, just like I taught you." Sterling's blood turned to ice. Taught him. The woman had taught the donkey to come to his property, to stand at that fence post every single morning at 9:15. This wasn't a mystery of animal instinct. This was a plan. It was deliberate. It was a message sent day after day for 3 straight months. But why? The footsteps were getting closer, approaching the kitchen doorway. Sterling knew he was cornered. There was no back door, no other way out. He was trapped. Taking a ragged breath, he made a decision. He pushed himself up slowly, raising his hands to show they were empty, keeping the rifle held loosely and non-threateningly at his side. "Don't shoot," the woman's voice said, calm and steady. "I've been expecting you." Sterling turned. He found himself face to face with a woman who looked to be in her late 60s. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat, practical bun, and her eyes held a spark of something he found shockingly familiar. She was dressed for work, not for hiding. Sturdy boots, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt that had clearly seen its share of hard labor. This was no drifter, no squatter. This woman belonged here. "Ma'am," Sterling said, his voice hoarse. He tried to keep his tone even, careful. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is supposed to be an abandoned property." The woman offered a small, wry smile, and in that expression Sterling felt a jolt of recognition so strong it almost buckled his knees, though he couldn't for the life of him place it. "Abandoned?" she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "Son, I've been living right here for the last 12 years, ever since my husband passed, and I've been waiting for 3 months for you to finally get curious enough to come over and introduce yourself." Sterling just stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. "You're Mrs. Henderson?" "Was," she corrected him gently. "Now I'm Cora Lane. Took back my maiden name after William died." Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, narrowed as she studied his face, really studied it. "But that's not what's important right now. What's important is why you have a stack of letters addressed to me sticking out of your jacket pocket." Sterling looked down. The corner of an envelope was peeking out, a white rectangle of damning evidence against the dark fabric of his jacket. A hot flush of embarrassment spread across his cheeks. He'd been caught red-handed, a common thief in a stranger's kitchen. I found them on your kitchen table," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "They have my family name on them. Maddox Family Trust." Cora's expression softened instantly, the hard lines around her eyes easing. She pulled out a simple wooden chair from the table. "Then you better sit down, Sterling Maddox," she said, her voice now gentle. Because it's high time you learn the truth about why your grandfather left you this ranch, and why I've been waiting so very long to meet you. Sterling sank into the wooden chair, his legs suddenly feeling weak. The world had tilted on its axis. Nothing made sense. Cora moved to the stove, her movements practiced and efficient, and began preparing coffee as if this were the most normal conversation in the world. The familiar, comforting smell of brewing coffee filled the small kitchen. Your grandfather, Thomas Maddox, she began, measuring dark grounds into an old-fashioned percolator. He was my business partner for nearly 20 years. Cora's words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. This ranch, the one you just bought from the bank, it was originally half mine. Sterling's jaw dropped. He felt a protest rise in his throat, a denial based on the cold, hard facts of legal paperwork. That's, that's impossible. The deed shows, the deed shows what Thomas wanted it to show, Cora interrupted, but her tone wasn't sharp. It was patient, like a teacher explaining a difficult concept. After my first husband, William, died in a ranching accident, I was left with nothing but debt. I was desperate. Thomas, he helped me. He bought my half of the property, but he did it with a promise. A gentleman's agreement that I could buy it back whenever I got back on my feet financially. She moved to a nearby cabinet and pulled out an old carved wooden box, setting it on the table between them with a soft thud. She opened the lid. Inside, it was crammed with dozens of documents, old photographs faded to sepia, and bundles of handwritten letters tied with faded ribbon. Thomas was a good man, she said, her voice thick with memory, but he was also a shrewd businessman. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left very specific instructions in his will for his family trust to contact me. He intended to honor our original agreement. He always honored his word. Sterling reached into the box, his fingers brushing against a photograph. He pulled it out. It showed a much younger Cora, her smile bright and wide, standing next to a man he recognized instantly from the few family pictures he owned. His grandfather, Thomas Maddox. They were both beaming, standing in front of what looked like this very same kitchen, the same cabinets, the same window. So these letters, Sterling said, pulling the stolen envelopes from his jacket and laying them on the table. They're about selling the land back to you? Cora nodded, her eyes sad. Half of it. The trust has been trying to get in touch with me for months, but I never opened them. I was too proud, I suppose. Too stubborn and set in my ways. I figured if Thomas Maddox's grandson was half the man his grandfather was, he'd make the effort to find me himself. A wave of understanding, followed by a flush of shame, washed over Sterling. The donkey, the daily vigil, it was all a test, a summons. So you trained Moses to come to my property every day. Trained is a strong word, Cora said, a genuine chuckle escaping her lips for the first time. Moses here used to belong to Thomas. After your grandfather died, that stubborn old donkey somehow found his way back here, all the way from your family's main ranch. Just showed up one day and decided to stay. I just encouraged him, taught him to visit his old grazing grounds at the same time every morning. I knew, I just knew that eventually your curiosity would get the better of you and you'd follow him home. Sterling glanced out the window. Moses was now peacefully munching on a patch of grass near the fence line. His job apparently done. You've been waiting 3 months for me to introduce myself. Son, I've been waiting 5 years for any of Thomas's family to remember the promises they made, Cora said. And for the first time, he heard the deep, old hurt in her voice. Your grandfather always used to say that a Maddox honors their word. It's the family creed. I was beginning to wonder if that was still true. With trembling hands, Sterling picked up the top letter and carefully broke the seal. He unfolded the thick legal paper inside. It was exactly as Cora had described. A formal offer to sell back her half of the original, combined property at a fair market price, with a clause stating that all legal fees would be covered by the Maddox family trust. It was all there, in black and white. A promise, waiting to be kept. Why didn't you just come over? Sterling asked, his voice quiet. Why not just knock on my door? Cora's eyes twinkled with a flash of mischief, a glimpse of the younger woman in the photograph. Son, I'm 68 years old. I've learned that when you want something done right, you don't ask for it, and you certainly don't leave it to chance. You make it impossible to ignore. And Moses, she said, nodding toward the window, has proven to be far more reliable than the United States Postal Service. Sterling let out a laugh, a sudden, sharp sound that broke the tension that had been gripping him for hours. It felt good. The mystery was solved. The fear was gone. But a whole new set of complications was just beginning. So, he said, looking at the woman who was supposed to be a ghost, his neighbor, his grandfather's secret partner. What happens now? Cora stood up, her posture straight and proud. She extended a weathered, calloused hand across the table. Now, she said, her gaze steady and clear, we become neighbors, properly. That is, if you're a man who is willing to honor your grandfather's promise. Sterling looked down at the legal documents, then at the faded photograph of his grandfather standing next to this incredible woman, and finally into Cora's unwavering eyes. The answer came easier than he could have ever imagined. He stared at the legal documents spread across Cora's worn kitchen table. The paper felt heavy in his hands, each typed word representing a piece of a past he never knew existed. The weight of his grandfather's promise, a silent vow made decades ago, was now settling squarely on his shoulders. The numbers were stark and clear. Cora Lane was entitled to buy back her half of the ranch for the exact price Thomas had paid her 20 years prior, with a small adjustment for fair market value. But even with the adjustment, the figure was daunting. This is a lot of money, Sterling said quietly, the words feeling inadequate. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture doing nothing to calm the storm of calculations and anxieties brewing in his mind. More than I have right now. Cora poured 2 cups of strong, black coffee into thick ceramic mugs and sat down across from him. Her presence was calming, her movements unhurried. I know it is, son. That's why I never pushed the issue. I figured if the family trust was reaching out, they'd have the funds ready and waiting. It was Thomas's way of doing things. He never left a loose end. Sterling picked up his coffee cup, the warmth a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of his thoughts. He'd poured nearly every dollar of his life savings into buying this ranch from the bank just 3 months ago. The family trust his grandfather had established was a vague concept to him, something handled by lawyers in a distant city. He'd never been directly involved in its management, never had a reason to be. I need to make some phone calls, Sterling said, his voice gaining a sliver of resolve. I need to talk to the lawyers who are handling the trust. Of course, Cora said, her tone understanding. She took a slow sip of her coffee. But Sterling, before you do, I want you to know something. If the money isn't there, I'm not going to force this. I won't hold you to a promise that isn't yours to keep. I've been happy enough living quietly in this old house. Moses and I, we have a good life here. Sterling looked out the kitchen window. Moses, the gray donkey, was now lying down in a patch of warm afternoon sunlight, looking perfectly content. The entire situation felt surreal, like a half-remembered dream. Yet the coffee in his hand was real. The woman across from him was real, and the legal documents on the table were undeniably real. Can I ask you something? Sterling said, turning back to Cora. Why didn't my grandfather tell anyone in the family about you? About this arrangement? It doesn't make sense. Cora's expression grew thoughtful, her gaze turning inward as she sifted through old memories. Thomas was a private man, she said softly, and a proud one too. I think he wanted to handle this himself, in his own time, a private debt between partners. When he got sick, it all happened so fast. He probably figured the lawyers and the trust he set up would take care of everything, just as he'd planned. She paused, her eyes meeting his again. He talked about you, you know. In the last few years we worked together. He said you were the only one in the family who really got it. The only one who understood what it meant to work the land, to have dirt under your fingernails and feel the sun on your back. Sterling felt a lump form in his throat. He'd barely known his grandfather. He had a handful of memories of visiting the sprawling family ranch as a small child, but Thomas had always been a distant, almost mythical figure. The idea that this man had not only thought of him, but had seen something of himself in him, was overwhelming. The fact that Thomas had specifically left him this property, this specific piece of land bordering Cora's, suddenly felt less like a random inheritance and more like a carefully orchestrated plan. There's something else, Cora said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She reached back into the old wooden box on the table. Her fingers searched for a moment before pulling out a single sealed envelope. It was yellowed with age, and on the front, in his grandfather's familiar, slanted handwriting, was his name, Sterling. Thomas left this for you, Cora said, her voice gentle. He told me I was supposed to give it to you, and only to you, when we finally met. Sterling's hands shook as he took the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. He carefully broke the wax seal, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a short, handwritten message. Sterling, Coraline is the best neighbor and partner a man could ask for. She taught me more about ranching than I ever taught her. Honor this debt not because you have to, but because it's the right thing to do. The land is better when good people work it together. Thomas. Below the message, sketched in the same ink, was a simple hand-drawn map of the property. It showed a clear line of division, but also notes on shared water access and annotations about where the best grazing lands were. Thomas hadn't just envisioned a sale, he had envisioned a future, a partnership. Sterling folded the letter carefully, the old paper soft and worn beneath his fingers. He looked up at Cora, who was watching him with patient, knowing eyes. He didn't need to make a phone call to know what he had to do. The path forward was clear. I'm going to make this right, he said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised him. Whatever it takes. But even as the words left his lips, a cold knot of reality tightened in his stomach. He was making a promise, just as his grandfather had. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the real challenge was just beginning. Sterling walked back to his own house as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His grandfather's letter was folded carefully in his shirt pocket, a tangible link to a man he now felt he was just beginning to know. In his other hand, he clutched a scrap of paper with Cora's phone number neatly written on it. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the land, and in the distance Moses had wandered back to his usual spot near the fence line, a silent, gray silhouette against the dying light. Inside his own kitchen, the familiar space now feeling strangely foreign, Sterling pulled out his phone. He dialed the number for Morrison and Associates, the law firm whose name was printed on the letters from the trust. His hands were steadier now, his purpose clear, but his heart still hammered against his ribs as he waited for the call to connect. Morrison and Associates, this is Janet speaking. Hi, this is Sterling Maddox. I need to speak with someone regarding the Thomas Maddox Family Trust. Of course, Mr. Maddox. One moment, please. I'll transfer you to Mr. Morrison. Sterling began to pace the length of his small kitchen, the worn floorboards creaking under his boots. He glanced out the window toward the Henderson house. A warm, yellow light had just flickered on in the kitchen window. Cora was starting her evening, probably following the same quiet routine she'd adhered to for 12 lonely years. Sterling, good to hear from you. A man's voice, calm and professional, came through the line. This is David Morrison. I was hoping you'd call. We've been attempting to reach a Mrs. Cora Henderson regarding a property matter connected to the trust. That's actually why I'm calling, Sterling said, stopping his pacing. I found her. She's been living in the Henderson house this whole time. She goes by Cora Lane now. There was a brief, surprised silence on the other end of the line. Excellent. That's excellent news. Did you have a chance to give her our letters? I did, Sterling said. He took a deep, steadying breath. This was it, the moment of truth. Mr. Morrison, I want to honor my grandfather's commitment to her. I want to make this right. What do I need to do? There was another pause, longer this time. When Morrison spoke again, his professional tone was warmed by a note of genuine approval. Well, that's wonderful to hear, Sterling. Truly, your grandfather would be very pleased. He set aside specific funds for this very situation. The trust has been managing those investments for the past 5 years, and I'm happy to report they've grown quite considerably. Sterling felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. The knot of anxiety in his stomach finally began to loosen. So the money is available? More than available, Morrison confirmed. Your grandfather was very specific about this arrangement. He wanted to ensure Mrs. Lane could buy back her portion of the property at the original price, plus a reasonable appreciation. He was adamant about it. According to our calculations, that comes to a total of about $47,000. Sterling nearly dropped the phone. 47,000. He had been bracing himself for a number 5 or 6 times that amount, a figure that would have crippled him financially. He had been picturing selling off equipment, taking out loans, a decade of struggle. Your grandfather was a very clever man, Morrison continued, oblivious to Sterling's shock. He structured the trust to cover any significant difference between what Mrs. Lane could afford and what the land was actually worth on the current market. He never wanted money to become a barrier to keeping his promise. Sterling looked out the window again, at the land stretching out before him, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. His grandfather hadn't just left him a ranch, he had left him a legacy of honor, foresight, and integrity. Thomas Maddox had thought of everything. He had planned for this exact situation years before Sterling even knew this ranch would be his. There is one thing, though, Morrison said, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. A stipulation in the trust. It requires both parties to agree to the final terms in person, with a legal representative present as a witness. It's an old-fashioned way of doing things, but your grandfather insisted on it. He wanted to make sure everyone involved looked each other in the eye and understood the commitment they were making. When can we do this? Sterling asked, his voice eager. I can drive out there tomorrow morning, if that works for both you and Mrs. Lane. We'll need to officially survey the property boundaries and draw up the final paperwork, but it should be a straightforward process from here on out. Sterling looked across the darkening property line toward Cora's house, a single point of light in the vast landscape. She was in there, probably wondering how his phone call was going, wondering if her 5-year wait was finally over. Mr. Morrison, Sterling said, an idea beginning to form in his mind, an idea sparked by his grandfather's hand-drawn map. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss. It's about how the property gets divided. As Sterling began to explain his grandfather's sketch and his own burgeoning ideas about how to make this more than just a division of land, how to forge a real partnership, he realized he wasn't just honoring an old promise anymore. He was beginning something entirely new. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Moses was already stationed at his old fence post, but his posture was different today. He stood relaxed, his ears forward, as if he knew something important was about to happen. Sterling had barely finished his first cup of coffee when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A black sedan was making its way up the long dirt road that led to the two properties. David Morrison stepped out of the car, carrying a worn leather briefcase and a tripod of surveying equipment. He was a tall man in his 50s, with graying temples and the calm, confident bearing of someone who had navigated thousands of complex transactions. Beautiful land, Morrison said, shaking Sterling's hand firmly. Your grandfather chose well when he first bought this place. Just then, Cora emerged from her front door. She was wearing a simple, clean dress and what looked to be her best pair of boots. Moses trotted happily to her side, nudging her hand with his nose like a faithful dog. Sterling noticed she'd taken extra care with her appearance, her silver hair neatly pinned. He realized with a pang that this moment, this formal meeting, meant just as much to her as it did to him. It was the restoration of her history, the validation of her long-held faith. Mrs. Lane, Morrison said warmly, extending his hand to her. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Thomas spoke of you often during our meetings over the years. The three of them spent the better part of the morning walking the property boundaries. Morrison set up his equipment, taking precise measurements and making careful notes on official-looking forms. Sterling was continually amazed at how much Cora knew about every inch of the land. She pointed out hidden springs, explained the nuances of the soil in different pastures, and knew the history of every fence line. She hadn't just been living on this land, she had been its faithful steward. According to your grandfather's original agreement and the trust documents, Morrison explained as they stood near the main corral that straddled both properties, the land should be divided right along this creek line here. It's the most logical boundary, giving Mrs. Lane access to both fresh water and prime grazing land. Sterling pulled out his grandfather's old hand-drawn map. He smoothed it out on a fence rail and compared it to Morrison's professional survey. They were nearly identical. Thomas Maddox had known this land as well as Cora did. "That works for me," Sterling said, folding the precious map and putting it back in his pocket. "But I'd like to propose something additional." Both Cora and Morrison looked at him, their expressions filled with curiosity. "Instead of just dividing the land and becoming neighbors," Sterling began, the words feeling more right the more he said them. "What if we formed a partnership? We could share resources, share the work, and share the profits from any cattle or crops we raise. My grandfather's letter said it best. The land is better when good people work it together." Cora's eyes lit up, a spark of the young woman in the photograph returning to her face. "You mean like Thomas and I used to do before William died?" "Exactly like that," Sterling confirmed, a grin spreading across his face. "We each own our portion legally, of course, but we work the whole spread together practically." Morrison smiled, a genuine, appreciative smile. "That's actually quite a smart arrangement from a business perspective," he chimed in. "You'd share equipment costs, which are substantial. You'd have shared labor during busy seasons, like calving and branding. And you'd have much better negotiating power with suppliers and at market if you're selling as a larger operation." They spent another hour hashing out the details, their conversation filled with an easy excitement. Cora would officially buy back her half of the original property for the agreed-upon $47,000, paid directly from the family trust. Both properties would remain independently owned, but they would be operated as a single, joint venture for all ranching activities. As Morrison leaned on the hood of his car, preparing the final paperwork that would legally bind their new partnership, Sterling watched Moses. The old donkey was wandering freely between both properties, no longer confined to just watching from a distance. He was home. "There's one more thing," Cora said, her voice soft but firm, as they all gathered to sign the documents. She gestured with her pen toward the donkey. "Moses, he belongs to both properties now. He's been trying to tell us that for the last 3 months." Sterling laughed, a deep, heartfelt sound. "I think Moses figured this whole thing out long before we did." As the three of them signed their names to the stack of official documents, the ink drying in the warm sun, Sterling felt a profound sense of completion. It wasn't just about honoring his grandfather's promise anymore. It was about creating something new, something that felt bigger and stronger than any of them could be alone. The mystery of the donkey's daily ritual was finally solved. But the real story, the story of the Maddox Ranch, was just getting started. 6 months later, Sterling stood in the exact same spot where he'd first watched Moses's mysterious daily vigil. But the world looked entirely different. The old fence between the two properties was still there, a marker of history, but it now had gates at 3 different points. The gates were always open, allowing for the easy movement of cattle, equipment, and people between both sides of the unified ranch. Moses no longer needed to perform his morning ritual. The old gray donkey spent his days wandering freely across the combined properties, often following either Sterling or Cora as they went about their chores. He'd become the unofficial, four-legged supervisor of their joint operation, a constant, comforting presence who always seemed to appear wherever the work was happening. The partnership had exceeded both of their wildest expectations. Cora's decades of hard-won experience with the local climate and the unique challenges of the soil combined perfectly with Sterling's younger energy and his knowledge of modern ranching equipment. Their first joint cattle sale had brought in more profit than either of them had ever made individually in a single year. "Sterling, come look at this," Cora called from the main corral, her voice filled with pride. She was examining a wobbly, newly born calf. Sterling walked over, wiping a line of sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove. He'd spent the morning repairing fence posts on the far side of the property, hard work that left his muscles aching, but his mind clear and satisfied in a way his old office job never had. "Healthy little bull," Sterling observed, watching the calf nuzzle close to its mother. "He's a strong one." "Just like his father," Cora said with a proud smile. "This breeding program your grandfather started all those years ago, it's finally paying off. We're going to have some fine stock to sell next spring." Sterling leaned against the corral fence, looking out across the property that now felt truly like home. The old Henderson house was no longer a derelict, abandoned shell. Cora had painted the shutters a cheerful blue and planted a riot of colorful flowers around the front steps. His own house now had a new, larger barn and an expanded corral to accommodate their growing herd. Both properties looked lived in, cared for, and alive. You know, Sterling said, a thought occurring to him, I never did thank Moses properly for bringing us together. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Moses appeared from around the corner of the barn, his long ears pricked forward with intelligent interest. Sterling chuckled, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a crisp carrot he'd saved from lunch. He offered it to the donkey, the quiet hero who had solved a mystery neither of the humans had even known existed. Moses accepted the treat with a dignified nod, then returned to his important task of grazing, content in the knowledge that his work was finally done. That evening, Sterling sat on his front porch, a ledger book open on his lap as he reviewed the ranch's financial records. The partnership had done more than just honor his grandfather's promise. It had created something stronger and more resilient than either property could have been alone. The joint venture was profitable, it was sustainable, and it was built on the kind of deep, mutual respect his grandfather had always valued above all else. Across the way, he could see the warm lights glowing in Cora's windows. She was probably in her armchair, reading a book or working on the detailed breeding charts they now maintained together. Over the past 6 months, they had developed an easy friendship, a comfortable bond built on shared goals and complementary skills. Sterling closed the ledger and looked out over the land that now belonged to both of them, a single thriving entity. The mystery of the donkey's daily ritual had led him to discover more than just a dusty family secret. It had led him to a deeper understanding of what his grandfather had meant in his final letter. The land is better when good people work it together. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, Moses appeared one last time, a perfect silhouette against the purple sky, as he made his leisurely way toward the barn where he'd chosen to spend his nights. The old donkey had accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. He had brought two neighbors together, healed an old wound, honored a forgotten promise, and helped create a new future. The ranch was complete. The promise was kept. And Sterling Maddox finally truly understood why his grandfather had trusted him with this extraordinary legacy. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another captivating Western tale where unexpected bonds and hidden truths change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories just like these. Your support means everything to us.